Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of McGill's Research Group on Constitutional Studies, a unit of the Jan P. Lynn Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. I begin by acknowledging that McGill University is situated on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which the peoples of the world now gather. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies brings together scholars in political theory, political philosophy, constitutional and public law, legal theory, from across primarily political science, philosophy, and the Faculty of Law at McGill. It brings together scholars at all levels of McGill, ranging from undergraduate through graduate students and postdoctoral scholars to faculty. It is dedicated to the study from a variety of empirical and normative perspectives of the fundamental orders that shape our constitutional societies. The RGCS Lecture Series invites leading scholars to McGill to present their research in a student-accessible way, trusting that excellent researchers are also capable of being excellent teachers and of treating serious matters in a way that serious students will be able to understand. And for more than 10 years now, our visiting speakers have risen to that occasion, coming to McGill to present their ongoing research on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society. Our speaker today is Kevin Vallier, Associate Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Program in Politics, Philosophy, Economics, and Law at Bowling Green State University. Professor Vallier has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Arizona, where he studied with the late Gerald Gauss, who 10 years ago, almost to the day, gave an RGCS lecture in this room to an audience that includes participants who are still here among us. In the 10 years since that time, Professor Vallier's career has been meteoric. He is the author of 4 books in those 10 years, the editor of 5 more, the author of a wide list of articles across philosophy, philosophy of religion, political philosophy, political psychology, to the annoyed envy of the political scientists in the room. He has hit the hat trick of publishing in the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. His books include Liberal Politics and Public Faith, Beyond Separation, Must Politics Be War? Restoring Our Trust in the Open Society, Trust in a Polarized Age, and most recently, genuinely hot off the presses, All the Kingdoms of the World, on radical religious alternatives to liberalism. He's established himself as a leading scholar in the public reason school of political philosophy, extending it in important new directions and drawing on a very wide range of methodologies in the course of doing so. While trained as an analytic philosopher and in a department that took seriously the border between philosophy and economics, he's extended his research in the decades since that time in the direction of serious studies of psychology and experimental psychology, empirical political science, including democratic studies and the study of democratic trust, and to a degree that is, I think, genuinely unparalleled in the public reason school of philosophy and in most of political philosophy altogether, in taking very seriously the philosophy of religion and theology. In his newest book, parts of which he is going to talk about with us today, he adds to that interest in political theology and the philosophy of religion a serious, thoughtful engagement with the history of ideas and the history of both political and political religious thought over the course of some centuries. I'm delighted that it's worked out that we are able to have him come join us so soon after the appearance of the book, and I'll ask you to please join me in welcoming Professor Kevin Vallier.
Jacob, sorry, better get a handout. So I'm so honored to be here. I'm delighted that all of you came, in particular because this book is, I guess, what we would call political theology. And the intersection of the different things I'm working on, I didn't really expect the kind of interest that there's been. So I'm grateful to Jacob. I'm grateful to all of you for coming. So one of the most interesting things that happened in 2016, in particular in the United States on the American right, was that a host of kind of minor ideological groups all of a sudden kind of came to prominence in what we now call the New Right. Most of these factions are, in my opinion, maybe not terribly intellectually rich, but very surprisingly, there was one that was. There was one that had a lineage that went back for centuries, and that some of the finest philosophers in the canon, from Aquinas to Suarez, and to strange and interesting figures that you read that philosophers don't, like Joseph de Maistre, had addressed these issues in great detail. And one of the things that fascinated me was how exactly did this ideology return? And so when I started to think about, I had to trace the history of the ideas. And the view that I'll be talking about today, I just want to go ahead and define it so we know what we're talking about, because its proponents often do not. This is the doctrine of what is called Catholic integralism. Now, this is a radically different method than most of you are used to in political thought. The way we often do political thought is we think of in terms of a single polity, where the interesting questions are about the relationship between the individual, civil society, and the state. But the integralist does what I call two-polity political theory. The first polity is the one we talk about, the temporal polity. But the other polity is the church. The church has its own law, it has its own courts, it has its own constitution, it has its own electoral procedures. But it was concerned with eternal things. But nonetheless, it has its own citizens, the baptized. And so for much of medieval political thought, medieval political theory was two-polity political theory. If you read a lot of these figures, they're thinking very clearly of, okay, what is the relationship between the church and the state, but not in terms of questions of separation, but in terms of integration. So they come to what we can think of as a deeply theocentric political theory, both of political authority and of the human good. And they believe something roughly as follows. God engages in two moments of authorization of different regimes. God authorizes the state to pursue the temporal common good, and God authorizes the church to serve the spiritual common good of its members and to engage in the Great Commission with everyone else. But the way many historical integralists have reasoned is they say, look, the church has a nobler end. And of course, Pope and crown impinge on one another. And in cases where the state might be of some assistance to the church can authorize the state, if it is Christian, in order to make its jurisdiction available for spiritual ends. Now, of course, the Pope can't take over agricultural policy on the grounds that people need to eat to go to Mass. That would be a kind of usurpation of divine power. But in cases, say, where communications policies or education policy would bear on our salvation, the church has a kind of indirect sovereignty over the state in such matters. So much so that in the history of political thought in the Catholic theology, this doctrine came to be called the doctrine of the indirect power. Now, we use the word power in a kind of non-moralistic sense, so I'll call it indirect sovereignty. But the doctrine of the indirect power actually develops from what I would say is figures like Aquinas kind of looking around at their surroundings and seeing that maybe this wasn't exactly what was observable, but something like what it was. And so for many integralists today, as odd as this is, one ideal regime was the reign of St. Louis, King Louis IX of France. And in particular, when one of his advisors became Pope Clement IV, they did have a kind of cordial relationship, though some historians dispute this, where it looked like St. Louis was pious enough in order to submit in spiritual affairs to the Pope. Indeed, he, I believe, died in one of the Crusades in Egypt. And so what you see in Aquinas, I mean, at least in my opinion, doesn't really have a systematic political theory, but he wrote this little book, De Regno, on kingship. In the last two articles, he says something that sort of looks kind of integralist, but it's very, very brief. Because this is in a period of church history where the power of the Pope, the temporal power of the Pope, was kind of at its crest. Within 35 years of the end of St. Louis's reign, you would have the famous contest between Philip the Fair and Pope Boniface VIII. And in time, the papacy would move to Avignon, and to a greater extent be under the influence of the French crown, and then, I believe some 70 years later, part of them would return to Rome, and all of a sudden you have two popes. The ability of two popes in order to credibly be international political institutions was hampered. And when, I believe this was also the Council of Pisa, appointed a third pope, deposing the others did not work, and for a brief period of time, until the Council of Constance, the popes were not able, I think, to reign in temporal affairs very clearly. Something at the Council of Constance happened that was also a problem. Because they deposed popes, they declared, I believe in the doctrine of Haec Sancta, that councils were superior to popes. Another challenge. And for the next several centuries, conciliarism in ecclesiastical authority was quite common until the First Vatican Council, and it's been largely forgotten. So this idea of the indirect power with time goes from something that's observable to something that becomes, in a certain sense, less and less practiced, in terms, in particular, of state building over time. And this gets down to the Counter-Reformation. Now, to understand this term, there's a period of what historians often call the Catholic Reform. Everything the church is doing, say, in the 16th century is not focused on Protestantism. But there is a distinctive movement, particularly with the Council of Trent, and then through a number of different military, ideological, philosophical, and legal efforts to make the case for this doctrine of the indirect power. So one of the first to articulate this was Vittoria. And Vittoria makes a really interesting argument. This is early the 16th century. There's this question of whether spiritual power is above the civil power. And what he says here is actually pretty clear. Because he says faculty, skills, and capabilities must be judged like all other things, ordained to a particular end by their purpose. And the purpose of the spiritual power far excels that of the temporal power, in the measure that perfect bliss and ultimate felicity excel all human and earthly happiness. So here the idea is the church has the nobler aim, and so it must be the superior polity. But you can't make the case, in particular from Scripture, that the Pope has total temporal power over the king. I think Romans 13, for instance, counts against that. But some decades later, Francisco Suarez and Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, would make the case for integralism at great length. First, the indirect power is a common doctrine in the school of Salamanca. Now, Bellarmine's not a member of the school, but of course Suarez is. And Bellarmine, being a cardinal, makes a more prominent case for the indirect power. It's very, very important to understand what the range of options on the relationship between ecclesiastical and temporal power was. There were those, for instance, Gallicans, who claimed that the king had ecclesiastical power, could, say, appoint his own bishops. On the other end, there are what are sometimes called hierocrats, those who believed, for instance, that the Pope had the temporal power to appoint and depose kings at will. And Cardinal Bellarmine develops a well-known doctrine, particularly prior to the Second Vatican Council, of the indirect power. And he says that the Pope as Pope does not have any temporal power directly or immediately, but only spiritually. Still, by reason of the spiritual power, he has at least indirectly a certain power, and that is supreme in temporal affairs. And this doctrine becomes really rather famous, but it's because it was being challenged by not only by Protestant regimes, but by Catholic kings. In fact, one of the reasons that Suarez develops his integralism in such detail is owing to James I's oath of allegiance, where English Catholics must swear their allegiance to James I. One of the things that Suarez and Bellarmine are fascinatingly concerned with is the power of popes to depose kings. And their argument was pretty simple. Kings are growing heretical right and left. You have to save the people from their heretical kings. All right, this was a doctrine of limited government for them, but it was also a distinctly moderate position between, say, the power, ecclesiastical power of the king, and the temporal political power of the Pope. In fact, Bellarmine got in trouble with Pope Sixtus V, who was a hierocrat. So much so that if Pope Sixtus V hadn't died, I believe in 1590, he would have put Bellarmine's works on the index of forbidden books. Bellarmine became very, very famous for a number of reasons. He wrote a popular devotional work. He helped to carry out the Galileo trial. And he became fabulously important continuously throughout Catholic history. There are many universities still named after Bellarmine. He was beatified in 1930. He was made a doctor of the church in 1931. Bellarmine's going to come back up. So we go from Aquinas, who's kind of seeing something that looked like integralism. It was an observable thing, to something that was deeply under-challenged and becomes somewhat infeasible in most parts of Europe, owing to the Reformation and the consolidation even of Catholic confessional states. So for instance, it was Spanish crown that operated the Inquisition with papal permission. So this doctrine over time becomes less and less feasible, to the point that it's no longer a moderate position, but a reactionary one. So one of the interesting things about Joseph de Maistre is that he was a close reader of Bellarmine. And in his book, Du Pape, on the Roman Pontiff, he postulates a position, well, it's not quite clear to me whether it's hierocratic or integralist. It wasn't terribly focused on that. But there is a case, at least, that Maistre was an integralist. Now, one of the interesting things that happens throughout the course of the 19th century, particularly in Italian unification movements, is that many of you may not know, but in much of central Italy, the Pope had his own temporal domains, the Papal States. And in 1870, the Italian unification forces ended those states. It was also the case they basically trapped the popes in the Vatican, so that they became what were called prisoners of the Vatican. But if you look at the writings of Pius IX, and then the more measured writings of Leo XIII, there's a really good case to be made that they have some sympathies with integralism as well. Now, Pius IX has this document, Quanta Cura, and its appendix, a syllabus of errors, which looks like, to integralists, it condemns all of liberalism, whereas most people think he's condemning sort of French Revolutionary liberalism. But Leo was, I think, more careful of a thinker. He wrote 88 encyclicals. He helped to inaugurate Catholic political thought, or Catholic social thought, Catholic social teaching. If you've encountered varied schools of Thomists, he was one of the reasons that brought it back, because he'd had Jesuit education and knew Aquinas in part through a Suarezian lens. He wrote Rerum Novarum, which of course is the Catholic Church's one of the sort of social documents that affirms the right of private property, but not capitalism, but decisively rejects socialism. But it formalizes Catholic social thought. But a little known encyclical, Immortale Dei, is one on his view about ideal relations between church and state. And he thinks the church and the state must have a kind of orderly connection, like that of the unity of the soul and the body in man, as he puts it. And of course, this would mean the church is the soul, not the king. But Leo was an accomplished diplomat. In fact, he even encouraged French Catholics to participate in the Third Republic. He understood that anything like integralism was far off. However, I think there's still a case to be made that it was there in the encyclical. Particularly in his encyclical Longinqua to the American Catholics who are advocating for a proto-liberal position, he says, you're doing great. But the confessional state's the ideal. So integralism has now gone from an observable view to a moderate view, to a reactionary view, to a desperate view. Now, the 20th century brings a huge change in the currents of Catholic social thought in terms of relations in church and state. Part of this was just the utter infeasibility of confessional states in many places where the church wanted to have influence. The story here is quite complicated. It varies from society to society. But particularly after the Second World War, there'd been a variety of different figures, among them Jacques Maritain and John Courtney Murray, that were saying, look, the church needs to reconcile itself with the modern doctrine of religious liberty. One reason is they wanted to participate in the construction of the human rights regime after the Second World War. And for about 20 years, there's the build-up to the Second Vatican Council, where the case for a universal right of religious freedom continues to be made stronger and stronger. And if you read Murray and Maritain, they know exactly who they're dealing with. They're dealing with Bellarmine, they're dealing with Pius IX, and they're dealing with Leo XIII. Now, they're not using the term integralism. But the interesting thing about Maritain is he has a 1927 book called The Primacy of the Spiritual, where there's a little bitty mention of the indirect power. Now, this was after Pope Pius XI had condemned Action Française, forgive me for the butchering the pronunciation, which was actually led by an atheist anti-Semite, Charles Marat. But Maritain distances himself from the movement, but still seems somewhat sympathetic. Now, the book you may know best is Man in the State, where he's clearly saying, look, natural law and universal human rights are kind of on the same page. Murray is directly going after any kind of claim of the indirect power and then of the broader view of the confessional state. But again, if you look at Murray's many articles on the topic, again, they know the score. They know what's going on, particularly in the aftermath of Bellarmine's beatification and its being made of the doctor of the church. This is just 1930, 1931. And yet, the church issues its most comprehensive statement of religious liberty in 1965, Dignitatis Humanae, which makes extremely clear the human person has a right to religious freedom. It's grounded in the dignity of the person as made in the image of God. And this can be known by reason in Revelation. This beautiful document goes in article after article, naming religious freedoms over and over and over again. Integralism has gone from a desperate position to a schismatic one. The people that adopted or rejected Dignitatis Humanae had to go ultimately in a schism, including among them Archbishop Lefebvre, who wrote a book called They Heaven Crowned Him, criticizing the Second Vatican Council's doctrine of religious liberty. Integralism was dead as a doornail. It was maybe associated with some hangover supporters of Francisco Franco or Salazar, but that was it. It was dead. Think about it. Integralism, observable, moderate, reactionary, desperate, schismatic. How did the general progress against this view ever return? How is this even possible? Well, the story is very strange, friends. But I will tell it to you because I've been studying it. What was the demand for this view, and what was the supply? The demand for the view, I think, is the following story in the United States. For a long time, the Catholic Church had debated amongst itself about whether it could reconcile with American institutions. And some had said no, and some had said yes, and there were opinions in between. And Catholics had to gradually come out of being effectively second-class citizens, where people did not trust them, from secular people all the way to Protestants galore. And around the 60s and 70s and 80s, this basically happens. You have the cooperation between Pope John Paul II, Margaret Thatcher, and Ronald Reagan, a kind of integration between Western leaders and the papacy that was very strange and unusual. And think about today. Until Nancy Pelosi resigned, we have a Catholic president, a Catholic Speaker of the House, and 5 Catholic Supreme Court justices. If you told anyone that 100 years ago, they would not have believed you, particularly on Al Smith's disastrous run for president in 1920. He was a Catholic. So a lot of younger Catholics, particularly today would be in their 30s or 20s, very online, their view was that the LGBT rights movement, particularly after Obergefell, had effectively returned them to second-class status on university campuses. They could no longer be open about their views. They wanted to be able to hold certain high-status positions after they graduated, and now, after all of this time, Catholic doctrine was back on. A different kind or different part of Catholic doctrine, as they understood it, was back on getting them in trouble. And there are actually a host of sort of very talented young Catholic intellectuals that decided that the anti-American Catholics were right all along, that America had had a poison liberal pill from the beginning. They wanted to oppose theological liberalism, political liberalism, economic liberalism, all together. But Dignitatis Humanae stood in their way. This was the demand for integralism. The supply story is very interesting indeed. A philosopher, now emeritus at King's College London, Thomas Pink, devised a new interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae. His claim to fame was that he was one of the great living scholars of the Counter-Reformation theologians Suarez and Bellarmine, and also a student of the thought of Leo XIII. And here was the way he tried to square the circle. Immortality Dei, he thought, stated integralism in 1885. Dignitatis Humanae stated the doctrine of total religious freedom in 1965. 80 years, and there's a deep discontinuity. And here's what he says. and very few people accept this, but here's what he said. He said, look, the records of the council show that Dignitatis Humanae was only about the rights of the individual and small groups against the state. The council explicitly said in their records that they could not devise the proper position of the individual against the church. For instance, should the church still run heresy trials? So Dignitatis Humanae was silent about the powers of the church, totally silent on it, including, and here's the move, the church's power to authorize the state to serve as its secular arm. Now, most Catholics reason in the other way. You have a total right of religious freedom against the state. So the church can't authorize the state to violate religious liberty. Like, that would be the standard view. But Pink reasoned in the other direction, as a way of trying to make Dignitatis Humanae continuous with previous teaching. Interestingly enough, where he starts to develop this in 2008, he's a prominent user of academia.edu, and some of his articles have been downloaded, say, 12,000 times. And this was a project for him that had nothing to do with American politics. He's British. This is a church-facing project for Pink. He's trying to say, what's happened to the European church? European church forgot that it was a polity, wouldn't punish sin, and no association can survive unless it enforces its rules. And then, of course, he looks historically and he says, and that includes not just the Code of Canon Law, but the Civil Code as well, which in my opinion is going a little far. And interestingly enough, he gave a lecture in Trumau, Austria in 2012, where there was a priest, a Cistercian monk, who was American, Father Edmund Wallstein, who very much wanted to oppose liberalism root and branch. And I interviewed him. He said that when he heard Pink lecture, he was able to see that he could be a loyal son of the church. His parents were theologians, his grandfather was a theologian, and yet opposed liberalism entire. Finally, there was the supply of the demand for anti-liberalism. And Wallstein and others imported the doctrine to the United States, starting in 2013 in particular, and ultimately founding a number of blogs and writings and so on, magazines, a whole host of them. A lot of this carries itself out not just in blogs, on Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And I'd estimate today that there are now thousands of people that hold this position. And one reason was that another thing happened in 2016. A Harvard law professor, Adrian Vermeule, converted to Catholicism and to integralism. Vermeule's project is state-facing. He has been concerned as one of the great scholars of the administrative state. And yet now he was an integralist. How peculiar was this? But his authority, and in also the conversion of Sara Bomari, who you may know through the association of him with the drag queen story hour controversy in the United States, more and more people started to come in. And interestingly enough, I think Pat Deneen has also joined forces with them. In fact, the last chapter in Regime Change is called Integration, which is more than a tipping of the hat, I think. That book, well, so their project is state-facing. For instance, one of them, a very serious integralist, Gladden Papin, who was a political theorist at Dallas, Viktor Orban hired him in order to be president of the Hungarian Institute of Foreign Affairs, which is a think tank basically for spreading kind of his brand of illiberal conservatism. And they've been instrumental in helping to normalize Orbanist tactics in the Republican Party, which we can see in particular in some of the policy views and practices of, I keep wanting to call him Victor DeSantis, Ron DeSantis, my apologies. And in fact, it got so interested, it got so big, that Oxford Politics decided to commission a book on the topic. And one day, the invitation came to me. So it's this really strange phenomenon, what's going on. But among the New Right, they have the great intellectual influence, again, because of their extraordinary lineage. And in fact, I believe Vermeule is also an admirer of Bellarmine. His Twitter handle is Vermeulerman, which is a combination of Vermeule and Bellarmine. Now, I've told you about the life, death, and resurrection of Catholic integralism, and now I want to tell you what my critique is. I want you to understand what I'm trying to do. I have to be clear. There are plenty of critiques of integralism as a kind of non-ideal theory, in the sense of how it would actually work in practice. right? Which, would probably not be good. But I was much more interested in it as an ideal theory. And here's what's so interesting about this. It's not like a liberal or socialist ideal where if you get the institutions right, maybe you'll get the people right. These are folks that believe in an Augustinian doctrine of original sin. In fact, one of the whole rationales for integralism is this. Sin does not only lead us to violate natural law, it corrupts our knowledge of it. This is a Suarezian point. And so the point of the church, when it is primary in the proper way, is it will regenerate not only people's virtue, but their moral knowledge in the first place. And yet they didn't let their Augustinian views of sin lower their political sights. They're doing Augustinian ideal theory. Can you even say that? Right? Does that even really sort of make sense? So this ideal is one in which people are deeply sinful, okay? But they're going to be, according to the ideal, less sinful than they would otherwise be. And I thought here would be something really interesting. What if we engaged integralism as an ideal theory? To grant to its proponents that it would work as they say under favorable conditions. I imported a few tools from discussions of Rawls on stability, but there's an interesting similarity but dissimilarity between the Rawlsian project and the integralist one. First, the similarity. They both dislike modus vivendi regimes. A lot. They want stability to be based on people grasping and following the natural law. But unlike Rawls, who models people as having two moral powers, with the exception of the good and conception of justice, there's only one. Right? You're flourishing. This is a kind of Thomistic Suarezian theory. You have a capacity for a conception of the good, not merely to revise it, because once you got it right, you don't want to get it wrong. But the thought was that you would kind of grasp your good, and then the state and the church would kind of coordinate in order to realize both the temporal and spiritual common good. And they make a prediction, a qualitative prediction, which is that states that are integralist will decay slower or not at all relative even to Catholic states that merely enforce natural law. Again, because of sin. Sin will corrupt not only our ability to follow it, but our very knowledge of it. Think about this. Sin predicts pluralism. Think of the conservative Catholic critique of Protestantism. What do they say? They say, with Protestantism, even though they agree with Catholics on a lot of things, you'll get 10,000 denominations, right? There'll be massive agreement, even among people that believe the same creeds. So what's interesting about the Augustinian ideal, again, if you'll allow it, is that sin predicts pluralism even among heretics, like Protestants, which they're happy to call Protestants heretics, but among the unbaptized as well. So I wanted to say a few things to explain the ideal, and that's what I'm critiquing. I think integralism is not only bad in practice, it's bad in theory. So I didn't want anyone to be able to retreat and say, well, maybe it doesn't work right now, but it's still the best. And I wanted to say, no, it's not. So I'm going to do three things in my critique of the next half hour. I'm going to strip the ideal of its finery. I'm going to take away three things that an ideal is supposed to do. One is to guide action toward it and to help one apply to ordinary political life. The second is that it be stable in the way that integralists want, that it be morally stable, based on primarily people's moral action. And the third, that its moral principles are inconsistent, does not have a consistent account of justice. These are called the transition, stability, and justice arguments. I hope to spend about 10 minutes on each one. But I'm happy to go into more detail because each of them is a full chapter. And I have a very cheesy slogan that helps people remember it. It says, integralism, you can't get there. You can't transition to it. You can't stay there. Stability, and it's unfair. It's unjust. Okay. So now let me just go through the arguments. Remember, I'm thinking in terms of the ideal. So the first one's the transition argument. And here's the claim. One cannot transition from anything remotely resembling a modern democratic state to integralism without violating Catholic moral teaching. So it's not merely that integralism is infeasible, it's that it's morally infeasible. You can get there, maybe, but not morally. But if you obey Catholic social teaching, you'll never get there, almost certainly. What this means is that integralism as an ideal is not only action guiding, but it's dangerous. It's inviting Catholics who are drawn by the ideal to risk violating Catholic teaching. What a strange ideal to do such a thing. Here's the basic argument. It's pretty simple. You've got to do three things to get to integralism. You have to capture the state, you have to capture the church, and you have to get a modern state to submit to the church. None of these things are very easy. To capture the state, I actually studied models of ideological movements in the 20th century that were actually able to capture states. So here you have models of fascists, Nazis, which you could sort of separate maybe, the Bolsheviks, and then the Iranian revolutionaries. And there's some really interesting similarities between their models that are manifestly problematic from a Catholic point of view. They need an utterly devoted, this is just one example, military force in order to scare the rest of the military, right? The SS, brown shirts, Red Army, or what have you. You need some utterly devoted troops. I could go on, but even imagining how this would go in terms of co-opting a state, in terms of taking it over, is extremely hard to imagine. You'd also have to suppress a great deal of dissent. And that's also going to lead to human rights violations that are pretty manifest. But here's the bigger problem. Today, the Catholic Church has 1 billion members all over the world and 5,600 bishops. Not one is openly integralist. It's going to take a while to get them to elect, ultimately becoming cardinals, get them to elect an integralist pope. They have to get that pope to actually reinstall integralism. They have to find a state that will obey that position. So they have to get the church on their side. And right now, again, there's not one bishop that agrees with them that we know of. The last problem is timing the submission of the state to the church. In other words, say, submitting the United States to the Vatican. Now, why would any modern state do that? You tell me. What ends up happening with integralism is, given that the church has 1 billion members, given that modern states have millions of members, the strategists for integralism are going to have to solve three of the greatest coordination problems in the history of the human race. And even if they do it by the book. So what I want to conclude there is that integralism is not an action-guiding ideal, because it either tells you to do the wrong thing or it's impossibly far away and so it can't guide action. It's also interesting enough that almost all Catholic social teachings and judgments can be derived from other principles that don't require consulting the ideal at all. So Russell Hittinger has argued that the sort of four key principles of Catholic social thought are the dignity of the person, the common good, solidarity, and subsidiarity. But you don't actually need it to consult integralism to figure out what, for instance, Catholics should support in politics. You appeal to those. And there's already enough complexity there, right? There's 4 different principles. They could conflict. How do you order them? So that's the first thing I want to say about the ideal. But here's something the integralists tell me. They say, we don't care about transition. We don't care about it at all. What we care about is what's best. I've even had integralists tell me, well, it's a matter of faith. God will help us. And when I started to hear this, I thought, these really are counter-revolutionary romantics. I mean, these are not conservatives, really. I mean, if you think about it, they're not really political conservatives, are they? They want to say things like, well, we have no idea how to get there, but it's the best, even if it's unimaginably far away. They think they have enough knowledge, and this is also the weird Augustinian tension, to say, oh, it's the best even though we have no idea how to approach it, because, it might not be so lovely when we get there, right? So that's a transition argument. I think it captures Catholic conservatives, but again, I think it won't reach the counter-revolutionaries. So here are 2 more arguments. The first is what I call the stability argument. And I admit it has a number of moving parts, but it tries to show that integralist political theology, if you take jointly their positions theologically and politically, that they jointly predict that the regime, even if you could get there, would destabilize on its own terms. Now, I have a number of arguments to this effect, but let's review some important issues first. I promised myself I wouldn't use, but only mention the terms reasonable pluralism, because reasonable makes a lot of people upset. But there are 2 forms of pluralism that integralism predicts. One, just what I call natural pluralism. The principles of natural law are complex and many, and it's hard to weigh them. That's going to lead to really different political judgments. The fact that integralism is not dogma means there'll always be certain kind of governing elites that may think, oh, this is really problematic. But there's also unnatural pluralism, the pluralism predicted by sin, which I alluded to earlier. So the worry is that even if you have a society that's largely integralist, if you follow Pink's interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae, if there are any religious minorities that are unbaptized in this society, you can't restrict their freedom. The church historically dealt with this problem by restricting a lot of freedom, right? But if Pink's interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae is correct, you're going to have a kind of festering source of pluralism right under your nose. Now, one way to respond to this would say, oh, well, let's assume away religious minorities, right? But if you do this, all you've shown is the ideal is stable if everyone agrees. That's not impressive. What you want to show is that a society can survive certain kinds of challenges without falling apart. And one of those challenges is that every society has religious minorities. So you want to show that integralism can stabilize itself even if there's a sizable, say, 10, 20, 30% of the public is not on board, including also Catholics that aren't integralists, which is another kind of problem. Now, there's a number of reasons that I think the stabilizing forces, which include the unquantifiable presence of God's grace, and then also the use of coercion, which can easily get away from a modus or easily give way to a modus vivendi, which they want to resist. Right? Use too much coercion, you're cowing people into silence. You've got a relationship of mere power. They've got to avoid a modus vivendi. And yet they've got sin in the model. Maybe this is why it's hard to have an Augustinian ideal. Here's one dynamic. I can't go through all of them. Imagine there's a large population of unbaptized people, and their religious liberty is completely protected. Just go with me, okay? They have all the rights and liberties enumerated in Dignitatis Humanae. They can speak their view, they can build schools, they can build churches, they can have their own presses and so on. And so you've got this source of pluralism just sticking right there, and you can't do anything about it because you're respecting Catholic principles and principle, right? And now, suppose you're a Catholic parent, and you've got to decide whether to baptize your child. If you baptize your child in a church-authorized state, you not only incur spiritual liabilities, but criminal ones. If your child grows up to be an apostate or a heretic, they could be charged with serious crime. Or you could say defect into the pluralist zone. Or you could have black market baptisms. You could keep baptisms off the books. And in fact, this was actually not uncommon in certain places where quasi-integralist relationships reigned. In particular, Jews from Jewish ghettos that wanted to get out for a time, but that maybe reverted to Judaism later. And there's a bunch of really important challenges that come in this case that I'll get to in a moment with the final argument. So integralism makes baptism expensive. This is one of the difficulties. And remember, you've got these religious minorities, and they're totally protected. So here's one thing. You're accused of heresy, you go to an asylum. There's just so many different ways that the attempts to contain certain kinds of challenges are undermined if you're really going to respect this new interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae. So this is just one dynamic. There's a number of other ones. But the thought is that if you bring together jointly all the different claims that integralists make, integralism will unravel of its own accord. So that's the stability argument. This is, but perhaps the most complicated. I mean, when you throw in, for instance, free communication and high education, you've got a real problem. Think about Aquinas' sort of looking around and seeing integralism. The peasants don't know anything. How many opinions do you have to coordinate? A few thousand? How many people's beliefs would you have to coordinate today to make this work? 10 million? 100 million? People with college degrees? People who can communicate instantly? What would you do? How would you bring that about? How would you prevent disagreement from exploding? Protestantism explodes. Judaism will explode. Atheism will explode. It will all explode because they predict this. They predict it. So even if you can't get to integralism, you can't stay there. Not for long. Okay, now to my final argument, the justice argument. Here's a very curious feature of post-Pink integralism. The unbaptized have a gigantic number of religious liberties. As soon as they are baptized, imposing, say, the canon code and law backed by the civil code, right, because we got the church state integration, means that those religious liberties can be restricted. Now, if you look at Dignitatis Humanae, why does it say people have religious liberty? Because they're made in the image of God. Does that change when they become baptized? No. The foundations of religious liberty are still there. Baptism, even if you grant everything the church dogmatically teaches on the matter, is supposed to be a kind of moral transformer. It's supposed to transform baptism, rather, it's supposed to transform religious coercion from unjust to permissible, at least potentially just. And let me give you an example from the real world, the famed or infamous Motara incident. There was a Jewish family living in the Papal States in the mid-19th century. They had a Catholic nanny. Their little boy, Edgardo, was, at least according to the Catholic nanny, on the brink of death. Emergency baptisms are allowed within the Catholic Church under those conditions, and they're valid, that is, they hold. So Edgardo was baptized. Pope Pius IX got wind of this 5 years later. He decided that Edgardo's Jewish family would not raise him in the Catholic Church, and that every baptized child had a right to a Catholic education. Pius IX sent soldiers to take Edgardo from his family, and Pius IX raised Edgardo as his own child. This was an international incident. There were major Italian nation states, I think at least France and perhaps Italy and maybe Austro-Hungarian emperor. I'm not really sure. I can't remember right off the top of my head. This was also one of the first time that European Jews came together in a kind of self-understanding of something that had to be fought and resisted. But Pius IX was able to win out, and Edgardo became a priest. And one of the ways that modern integralism came to our attention is another strange story. There's a Jewish historian of Judaism and the Jewish people, David Kurtzer, who wrote a book about this called The Kidnapping of Edgardo Motara. Spielberg was going to make it into a movie with Weinstein, but that got set aside. But in anticipation of this, Edgardo's memoirs were published. And the sort of main Christian intellectual magazine, First Things, had it reviewed. They asked a Dominican priest, Father Romanio Cesario, to do the review in which he defended Pius IX. Much of First Things readers, including Yoram Hazony, were absolutely revolted. But there are a number of the integralists who said, look, Pius IX did what he had to do as a sovereign. Those were his duties, according to the law. Shocking. But according to integralism, it makes sense, in a way. An awful way, but in a way, right? Follow the logic out. Think about it, right? Baptism transforms the person. I believe that. But this idea that it transforms your legal rights and responsibilities, in this case, the taking Motara from his family was based on the rights of Edgardo. Say the right to Catholic education. What you have to believe, I think, to be an integralist under the best alternative interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae is that baptism, again, makes coercion go from unjust to just. So what I do in the book is I go through a number of different ways in which this might be squared. Aquinas has an interesting little article where he sees the tension. And he says, well, baptism's like a vow. You have to make the vow voluntarily. But you can hold people to it by force. Baptism's like that. But that doesn't address, and he didn't even mean to address, I don't think, infant baptism, where this doctrine applies. It applied in the case of Edgardo Motara. So I think infant baptism makes a real problem. And as long as, these aren't, folks that have any qualms with infant baptism. But it's also, I think, a pretty serious problem for adults, right? So someone in the Roman ghetto in, say, 1860 says, I need out of here for commercial benefits to get a better job so I can support my family. So I'm going to get baptized so I can leave. Then you revert to Judaism. These are crimes. This is apostasy, right? But if they'd been able to get out and they weren't baptized, it'd be a very different story. And I think that fundamentally does not make sense if you look at the reasons that Dignitatis Humanae itself cites. Because the dignity of the person is not changed, right? Baptism instills, for instance, supernatural virtues. It forgives, in a certain sense, original guilt. It leaves the foams of sin, that is, the tendency to concupiscence. But I think it is ultimately mysterious how this process is supposed to work. Now, there is an interesting reply here that I can cover briefly, which is this. Most of the conservative Catholics I know actually don't like this argument very much. And what they say is, well, look, we know baptism puts you under the code of canon law. That's not a problem. We don't know how, but we know that it's true. So all you need for integralism is for the church to be able to authorize the state to serve as its secular arm. Call this the authorization objection to the justice argument. This is a pretty interesting argument. John Venice's response to this is to say, look, the church can't grant the state an authority that it doesn't have. It doesn't have the authority to physically coerce. It can't grant the state that authority. It doesn't have it. Whereas the integralists have responded back, well, look, the church is a perfect society in the sense that it has all the means necessary in order to achieve its spiritual aims, and that includes physical coercion, which I think actually is starting to bleed into hierarchy. But here's something that's very peculiar about this, I think. This is a strange inference. Suppose, for instance, it seemed necessary to kill an innocent person in order to realize the church's spiritual aims. Well, that would violate natural law, right? That's not on the table. You can't say, oh, well, a perfect society would require everything that's required. The order of explanation, the order of moral explanation would be, look, the natural law holds, and so you can't say that a perfect society requires violations of natural law. But if natural law, as the Catholic Church currently teaches, requires religious liberty, then the church can't authorize the state to violate natural law. So it doesn't have the power of physical coercion in that case. So you can't appeal to the doctrine of the perfect society in order to try to save this idea that the church can authorize the state to serve it in spiritual matters. So there's a couple of different replies, but it's actually a pretty, in a certain way, pretty interesting discussion in political theology. Now, as I've tried to make the case here, and now I'll sum up, that I find integralism sort of deeply morally objectionable, and I think it's also objectionable as a piece of Christian theology. But there is a sense in which I'm grateful, especially to the British integralists, for talking about this. I see integralism as kind of the act utilitarianism of Christian political thought, right? I like examining act utilitarianism, but I don't want act utilitarians to have political power. Right? But isn't it fun to try to struggle with what's wrong with a position? Don't we learn a lot if we think, okay, well, what exactly is wrong with act utilitarianism? It's super coherent and has really disturbing moral implications, right? And integralism, I think, is much the same. It's this extremely coherent view. What should the state do? The good. What should the church do? The good. Oh, they should, promote the spiritual and temporal good in some kind of relation of integration. Okay, yeah, that's it sounds pretty plausible. This is effectively what the Counter-Reformation theologians, Vittoria's you wouldn't call him Counter-Reformation, it's a little too early. This is exactly what they thought. And, these are some of the best, philosophers and theologians of their time. And as I've repeatedly said, Bellarmine has a tremendous impact even now. So there's an argument. They have an argument. And I think it's not as attractive to say, well, it's unrealistic. It is. But the point is, even if you grant a lot of the assumptions that they're making, you've still got this gigantic transition problem. And if you grant all of their assumptions, the view is actually self-undermining. Because once you understand what all the different things that integralists say about political order, again, they're not jointly consistent. Not in they're logically inconsistent, by the way, but they're what I try to give is what I call an infeasibility proof. Okay? And then, of course, that the moral principles are internally consistent. Now, integralism in theory is not very attractive at all. It's not action guiding, it's not stable, it's not just. And so integralism is not only wrong in theory, it's wrong in practice. So let me say one more. I have a few minutes. I want to say something broader in response, more than just it's useful and helpful to engage it. We got into a lot of really rich, interesting questions. There's a huge amount to think through. But I also think that the integralists did something really, really fascinating. they discovered something that I think a lot of us didn't know, which is that there was a spectacular amount of energy for doing political theology among younger people, especially Americans on the right. And in fact, the rise of what people call Christian nationalism, this was actually a term the left used until a man named Stephen Wolfe wrote a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism. So we're getting a kind of reformed kind of nationalism. And there's a number of other books I've been told on reformed. You wouldn't call it integralism exactly, but you could, if you wanted to use the term more loosely, where I think we're going to start to see more proposals. But here's something else that's super important. The book doesn't only address integralism. In chapter 7, I look at Confucian anti-liberalism and I look at Sunni Islamic anti-liberalism. And I argue that actually some of the same costs and benefits of those views, you could see, some of the same costs and benefits of Catholic integralism also apply to these other views. So for instance, Confucius was very worried about a modus vivendi order. He wanted the order to come from virtue. And I think there are some really interesting difficulties for Islam, for the contemporary Islamic Democrats, to say on the one hand, you want, so Rashid Ghannouchi, who was one of the heads of at one point, the Tunisian Assembly, he wrote a book called Public Freedoms in the Islamic State that's been translated by Yale. It's really good. I mean, it's really, really interesting. And he was one of the great leaders of the Arab Spring. Unfortunately, right now, he's a political prisoner. But he has to reconcile the idea that there are certain burdens that can be placed on Christians and Jews that are not placed on Muslims, with the fact that he wants people to have equal political rights. So for instance, I think there's an interesting tension there, a kind of justice type tension. So I looked at these other anti-liberal views and studied them for, I think, a decent period, and found, okay, actually a lot of these anti-liberal views are coming up with sophisticated theologians. So I look at the work of Jiang Xing, who's a Confucian anti-liberal, who wants China to become a Confucian confessional state. And I also started to try to look at other anti-liberalism. I couldn't talk about them all. But right now I've been focusing more on Hindu nationalism, which is arguably the most successful anti-liberal movement in the world right now. Now, Hindu nationalism, I guess, has a lot of interesting differences. But you also have Shia anti-liberalism. I mean, that's familiar, right? So you have a number of these doctrines, and they're reviving themselves. They're reviving them. What's going on? Why are we seeing more of these doctrines? Well, let me just leave you with my guess why. Robin Dunbar, an evolutionary psychologist of religion, in his recent book, How Religion Evolved, says that we know of no society without religious people in it. Not that societies are especially religious, and he's a good working definition of religion, that many people in these societies have religious impulses. We also think that people, or at least many people, are inclined to politics. And this suggests that there are going to be people that have this passion for trying to see how their faith and their politics interweave. I think that's just a permanent feature of pluralistic societies. We just have to figure out how to address this. So liberal and socialist hopes that this problem would take care of itself, say through the creation of wealth and the progress of democracy and the progress of scientific reasoning, I think it's just turned out not to be true. The 20th century was actually a strange outlier because you had a variety of secular regimes that were effectively removing the political expression of the great religions. So sometimes this would be in Marxist regimes where, it was pretty authoritarian. But even in places like India and Turkey where, it was considerably less controlled, there was still the sense that these were secular states, right? And a lot of them have sort of gone back, right? And I don't want to say backward because I think these are human impulses that can work to the good of the people. And so I think the practice of political theology, its relative disappearance, not total at all, there are plenty of religious political movements in the 20th century. What was unique is how many secular political movements there were. I think we're just seeing humanity returning to its spiritual mean. And so I think the long-term project of engaging political theology, and political theorists and philosophers, even I think economists and historians, trying to address these views seriously is something that's with us. It's something that's with us. It's a project that I think should be a branch of what we're trying to do as theorists. So I'll just leave you with that. Thank you very, very much.
At RGCS Lectures, the first question is reserved for a member of the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellowship. So I will call on the first question from up here, and then I'll sit again. Look, yes. Speak up, though.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned some of the ideals that are in conflict in the
Justice argument. Yes.
So I was wondering if you can go over what those ideals are again, or maybe just
Yeah. Sure. The two commitments in this case are to respect, in a very strong way, the religious liberties of the unbaptized as a requirement of justice, and then the claim that it is not a violation of principles of justice to religiously coerce the baptized, including not just through the code of canon law, not just say excommunication, but through the civil code, right? Fines or something more extensive. So those are the two principles, I think, in tension. And remember just how important about this is that dignitatis humanae is still a problem for integralists. It's maybe less of a problem, but it's posing all kinds of little challenges here and there. I mean, dignitatis humanae really is a problem for integralism. It continues to be. It's just a little subtler now.
Thank you for an absolutely wonderful talk. I was wondering if you might say more about how the popularity of integralism in the present moment informs what people might be finding unsatisfied about liberalism.
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the interesting things about integralism is I know a number of people that converted to it from libertarianism. I know. Like I know, right? But there was something that started to happen, particularly as Christians became more prominent in metaphysics and epistemology, where when the new atheists came along, and we know now they overplayed their hand, right? And there were a variety of Christian philosophers, such as Alvin Plantinga, that were able to, at the very least, kind of hold their own. And I think this created a sort of lack of embarrassment of deep, committed faith among a variety of different intellectuals. So I've been hanging out with classical liberals, and 20 years ago, a Randian objectivist would say, "Oh, you're a mystic, you're irrational, or what have you." It doesn't really happen very much now. So I think one thing that's happened is that there are a variety of people who feel kind of more rationally and socially permitted to be religious believers. I mean, I'm not trying to say that right now that atheism is wrong or anything like that. I'm just saying that theistic philosophy revived in a way that was surprising. And so you have a variety of people that say, okay, maybe I'd rather go to Mass than read Atlas Shrugged. Maybe I'd rather meet God in the Eucharist than read Human Action. And Catholicism gives a sort of comprehensive story about the attractions and meaning of life, and all the different things that are a part of it. Now, libertarianism as a form of liberalism is trying to avoid this almost by design, right? Because the thought is, look, diversity is a permanent feature, and as opposed to, say, left liberalism, who tries to reconcile pluralism with democracy, they're trying to reconcile pluralism in the market. They're different, kind of projects with different inclinations for reconciliation, but that's ultimately, I think, the thought. And as you and I were talking about, these views that we're trying to say, look, we can all get along, we're not meeting young people's kind of spiritual hunger. And I do think that those of us, right or left, classical and market or egalitarian and social democratic, have to recognize that there's a way in which we were not feeding a need that many people have. Now, some of you might think everyone has certain spiritual needs, but we know many people do, right, at the very least. And there are a lot of young people that I've met. I met, over the course of this book, I met people 18, 19, 20, 21. They're encountering these integralist ideals and they're loving it. I met some people, through social media who the very first book of political theory they ever read was Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. And, I don't agree with that book, but the thought was from the get-go that there was something corrupt about liberalism. There was some way in which often the integralists will say, well, liberalism really is a kind of religion or something like that. I don't think these claims really work. But what they say is people's spiritual hunger is so deep that liberalism actually tries to feed it without being honest with themselves about it. And what it does is it gives people consumerism and atomism and all these kinds of really dysfunctional liberations. And ultimately they think that's going to be so unsatisfying to the human person that liberalism will collapse. So there's an interesting way to go. Either you think liberalism is a kind of agnosticism and so it doesn't meet people's spiritual needs, or you think it does but in the wrong way. So I think there's two ways to think about where liberalism might fall short. Now, interestingly enough, I mean, you go back to the liberalism communitarianism debate, there are people like Steve Macedo that are trying to say, look, there are liberal virtues, right? This has been addressed, right? If you go back even further to the kind of new liberals, I'd call them middle liberals, some of the British Hegelians, or John Dewey, they're trying to tell a story about how liberalism and democracy figures into a satisfying life. And so it's not as if liberals haven't attempted this. I mean, Mill has a theory of the good life. Right? A very rich one. It's not correct, but it's very rich. So liberalism has not always been this way. In fact, actually kind of neutralitarian liberalism, hasn't it always been uncommon in British liberalism? I mean, isn't that right? So, in fact, so it's a weird thing that people see the liberal tradition this way. And this is because the sort of anti-liberal, sort of integralists, it's weird, this is super strange, but they almost imbibe the story about the liberal canon that the Rawlsians set up. Like there's really no one between Mill and Rawls that they're looking at, just as we analytic philosophers are not trained to read people between Mill and Rawls, right? Because if you do that, you see all these liberals saying, look, liberalism was too individualistic, we have to combine it with a conception of community, we have to figure out how people realize their ultimate purpose, not only as individuals, but in society, and promoting the common good. This is a really big deal, say, for Thomas Hill Green, who's trying to import a great deal of ancient philosophy and Hegelianism into British politics as a major figure in the Liberal Party. So anyway, maybe too long of an answer, but I think you're right. Somehow liberalism has become construed as incapable of providing those answers. I'm not sure that's right, but that is certainly how it's seen. So.
Yes, question more from the recent intellectual history side of it.
Sure.
Who I'm writing on right now. You're completely right. He loves associating himself with the integralists.
Yeah.
He described himself as a foxhole with them. And
yes.
Education,
that's right.
And the final chapter. The thing is, he spends much more text in his recent book on Benjamin Disraeli and on Tory democracy.
Yeah.
As his preferred model of a new political regime that can channel this populist satisfaction with liberalism.
Yes.
And so my question would be, one kind of more detail, where do you think he fits in the kind of constellation of this particular ideology? And the second part, kind of more important, is would that satisfy some of the demand for integralism? Can that provide a supply that is closer to modernity? He acknowledges that Disraeli and Tory democracy is the future of modernity. Can it supply a modern answer to that demand as opposed to a Joseph de Maistre answer to that demand?
I mean, it's a very interesting question. In the chapter 4 of the book, I worked through a series of Vermeule's strategic writings that have come from a little article called Integration from Within, which is his review of Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed. And he says, look, all this decentralist stuff, it's not going to work. You can't stop liberals unless you get the state and fight them at the level of centralism. I actually think Deneen has gradually come around to that strategy, particularly in that he spent a great deal of time with Viktor Orban. And I think the thought is, look, we could get to decentralism, but we have to do centralism first. There's actually a number of little right-wing Marxian memes in some of their thought that's interesting. They have nice things to say about Marx. So I think the thought is you got to get the state big before you can do the decentralist part. You've got to have, oh, look, Hungary's banning gender studies, right? Okay, well, maybe we should control curriculum in the United States. So I think the thought is that often on these views, the left is seen as so culturally completely unstoppable that it requires serious force to stop them. And this is why Deneen says we have to pursue Aristotelian ends with Machiavellian means, right? So I don't think he's just envisioning a Disraeli kind of thing. I think he's moving, I don't say, he's called himself an ecumenical integralist, which I have a little article, it's kind of odd, but an odd notion. But I do think, I would say that I think from reading his work that he's in motion. And I think of regime change actually as kind of integration from within light. That it is proposing a strategy of replacing the elite, right? There's a key principle of anti-liberalism is that the left is so corrupt that you can't treat them as adversaries where you trade democratic power. They have to be stopped. They have to be replaced. So if you see, for instance, Deneen's article in First Things, replace the elite, right? This is a pretty serious project. This isn't Disraeli and Gladstone trading off, right? That's not what this is. This is a counter-revolutionary doctrine. And it's where a lot of people are. So.
I've got Arwen Loeb and Steve Mansour.
All right, I'll go faster.
Thanks. Yeah, so I was wondering if you could speak to the alliance between Catholic integralism and the New Right more generally, specifically considering that Catholicism is, to my understanding, focused on a sort of moral purity that maybe the other movements on the far right in the United States aren't pursuing.
It's such an interesting thing. It's precisely why I wrote the transition chapter. Because if you look at Vermeule's writings, he says two things. One, well, we have to get pretty serious about fighting against left. But he also has a piece in First Things called On Christian Strategy, where he says we have to follow Christian moral requirements to a T. And that's where I saw the tension. Because if you look at their theory of history, they've got a kind of quasi-Marxist view about the direction of liberalism. And I think they think that history is going to do the work for them. So they're not actually going to have to violate Catholic teaching. And here's basically how the story goes. If you know enough about kind of the details about how Marxism and Marx thought that capitalism would decay, is that capitalists pursue all of these returns to profits as they diminish at the margin. They get more and more desperate as they do so. And Vermeule postulates that liberals are much the same with liberation. They pursue the simple, big gain liberations like slavery, getting rid of slavery, and then with time, the things get wilder and more intense and smaller liberations, and he sees the LGBT movement along those lines. And he thinks liberalism can't ongoing attack the folk for their backwards opinions forever. Eventually people are just going to get tired of it because liberals are going to be so wacky and strange that they'll destroy it themselves, destroy their own legitimacy. I think in the background there's this thought, like with the Soviet Union, where kind of Marxism intellectually, ideologically, politically collapses, and then other people are able to go in and co-opt the state institutional apparatus. So, and I quote all of this stuff sort of in detail. So I think what's going on is that their theory of history and their theory of liberalism allows them to square their stated conception of moral purity on the one hand and their sort of counter-revolutionary ideas on the other. So it requires you have to add in their theory of history. Deneen also thinks that liberalism has kind of internal contradictions that will only work themselves out with liberalism's decline. Whereas I actually think liberalism's kind of the opposite. It's able to kind of take what's attractive about ideologies as super adaptable in some interesting ways. I think the Marxist analysis of liberalism they give is way too narrow. But nonetheless, that's how they square the circle, I think.
Steve.
Yeah, so aside from, you mentioned Catholicism, but you also mentioned exploring other integralist or anti-liberal traditions such as Islam, Hindu nationalism, and so on. In your work, do you explore other Christian denominations, for example, that do not have the declaration of this humane that is really the core of your argument, or is it just a feature of theistic traditions more generally that you base your argument on?
So the Christian case was pretty interesting. So I'm a recent convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, but I'm very much kind of American Orthodox. And I paid a lot of attention to what's going on in Russia, much to my sort of shock frankly, horror, what's going on. And, this kind of Caesaro-Papist ecclesiology that you see, where you have a strong czar, but before that you have a strong Byzantine emperor, really creates a very obvious practical problem, which is that it's just very easy to co-opt the church for political ends. There also isn't a lot of translated Orthodox theology. It's actually quite amazing how much, for instance, Marxism held Orthodoxy's intellectual institutions back, and also the extent to which Erdogan is doing that with the ecumenical patriarch. So there's just so much stuff that's untranslated. Even our Book of Wisdom from the Church Fathers of Hyla wasn't given a really nice edition and finished until a few years ago. So I think there's a lot of stuff there, but I just can't access it myself. But it's also, I think there's just less political theology in the East, in part because there wasn't a Reformation, where there was all of sort of iron sharpening iron in terms of doctrine. And so that's another reason why I think there's less developed theory. Now in Protestantism, there's this really deep commitment to religious liberty in most of the denominations that goes way back. And also many of them are believers baptizers. I mean, you don't baptize infants. And that would solve, a lot of the issues. But if you have to if you're a Baptist, right, and you're at all connected with Baptist history, this is not on the table. The closest thing to it was Christian Reconstructionism, which tried to have a kind of reformed view of enforcing sort of biblical law. But so much had been written on this, and there are disputes about how influential it was, that I kind of felt like I would be redoing things. But I was also told by someone intellectual in the New Right that there are more treatises of kind of reformed anti-liberalism on the way, and so I do plan to engage them when those books come out. My sort of task that I set myself to was to work through the treatises. And it just so happens that, the Confucian anti-liberal and the Sunni anti-liberal treatises were translated. So I could get really deep into them and really work through them. So a lot of it was just my linguistic limitations, but also the Protestant issue, and yeah.
Right here.
I was wondering what you think of Pope Francis' use of the word title when he talks about theology and that.
So Maritain has a book, Integral Humanism, and this is a sort of sort of rich and pretty beautiful, but in some ways kind of vague doctrine. I think that's what he's talking about. Although apparently privately he said integralism is a plague, and that's partly because he's an Argentinian and has the association of integralism with fascism. The integral language, he does have an environmental doctrine, right, in Laudato Si, I think it's very common for the popes to really like Maritain, at least since, and people correct me if I'm wrong, was it Paul VI who was Maritain student? I can't recall. So Pope Paul VI. So I think I think that terminology is the ongoing influence of Maritain and personalism in Catholic moral thought. So I think this was going on there. I could be wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes.
Yes. I was wondering where Anglicanism falls on the spectrum of radical anti-liberalism. Is it more, how you would say, a distant or failed idealism, or does it fall more into the spectrum of usurpation and the restructuring of the existing order?
So it's going to have some of the same problems as Orthodox Caesaro-Papism, where the king is the ecclesiastical authority, has sort of a certain kind of power of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Am I wrong that the monarchy appoints the Archbishop of Canterbury, or is that within the church? Yeah, it's the prime minister, right? Yeah, it's the prime minister, not the crown, the prime minister. Yes.
Prime Minister recommends.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
The crown does it on recommendation.
Yes, precisely. Okay, good. Sorry, I was going to have forgotten the details. But of course, modern Anglicanism is, I think, pretty on board in a lot of ways with liberal ideas. However, I did treat myself to actually reading Hooker for the first time. Hooker actually has, it's remarkably lucid defense of a kind of, what do we call the Erastianism in England? I can't remember the precise name for this doctrine in England, but But yeah, so actually he goes through and makes the interesting Old Testament case, particularly that the Jewish priesthood had no authority over Jewish monarchs, except for that of prophetic or condemnation or what have you. But I'm not taking the side of this. But I kept reading Locke and him talking about the judicious hooker, and so I thought, well, I better get around to actually reading of ecclesiastical polity. So there's actually an interesting case for a kind of Anglican establishmentarianism, but of course it's centuries old. There's a kind of mild establishmentarianism in Oliver O'Donovan, but I have a really hard time understanding what he's up to. So, thank you.
Time for one more question? Yes.
Lots of great questions about the theory. I have a more practical question.
Sure.
I'm convinced by your arguments that you can't get there, you can't stay there. When you're talking like a global level, something like the U.S., is there a chance of a sort of Catholic integralist equivalent of the Free State Project, where some small country or state becomes integralist? And would the advocates for it be happy with that if it meant leaving their country to go to that place, or is that a non-starter?
I have a alternative to Vermeule's integration from within called integration writ small, where I pursue a kind of Christian archipelago along the lines of Chandrankukha, this liberal archipelago. Orthodoxy is an interesting case of this. Those of you have heard of Mount Athos in Greece, where there are approximately 2,000 monks that essentially have a kind of quasi-theocratic polity. Now, of course, they're governed in part by the Greek Ministry of Foreign Affairs and then the Ecumenical Patriarch, but they're mostly autonomous. They've been a republic of monastics for about 1,000 years. Very small. Yes, that's a serious problem. I say that in the book, but I should have made it prominent here. Although there's some interesting stories about some women that were able to visit, but anyway, yes. And so I do think there are real worries about micropolities having certain kinds of hierarchies and exclusions. However, the thought, at least with the archipelago, is there'd be pretty costless freedom of exit, because they're very small they're very small states. This is going to be, I think, a problem for integralism, because the level of freedom of exit is going to make the stability problems pretty severe. Imagine you get baptized, you acquire criminal liabilities, you can travel a couple of miles and it's over. Part of integralism, actually, and this is shared by certain trends or threads of Islam, is this thought that leaving the faith is a crime, right? And so I think exiting the authority of the integral state on their emigration policy, they're not really teased out. So I think that would be the problem with the writ small. I think it would quickly destabilize the polity. Yeah.
All right, before we recess and thank Professor Vallier, there's a little bit more concluding business than usual tonight, but the first item of concluding business is, as usual, a book giveaway. Well, is Fionn here? Okay. Yeah, here. Fionn, come on up. We have some special things to celebrate tonight for our colleagues in the Research Group on Constitutional Studies. First, we have two of our faculty members who were recently elected to the Royal Society of Canada. Elected to the Royal Society's College of New Scholars was Jean-Alain Tremblay, Assistant Professor of Political Science. The citation from the Society reads, Jean-Alain Tremblay, a member of the Huron-Wendat First Nation, is an assistant professor in political science at McGill University. His transdisciplinary research explores the decolonization and indigenization of political theory. Centering indigenous lifeways and political practices in his scholarship, he challenges ongoing colonial dynamics in political thought that silence and distort indigenous views. Also elected to the Royal Society of Canada to the College of the Humanities is Jaruzelski Chair in the Department of Philosophy, Jocelyn McClure. The citation from the Royal Society reads, Jocelyn McClure is recognized as both an internationally leading academic philosopher and one of the most relevant public intellectuals in the Quebec and Canadian public spheres. First known for his work in moral and political philosophy on the pluralism of values, public reason, human rights, and cultural diversity, he's established himself as one of the main thinkers of secularism, laïcité, and freedom of conscience and religion. And finally, Daniel Weinstock, whose various titles at McGill include being an associate dean in the Faculty of Law, and I'm now drawing a blank, the Catherine Pearson Chair of Civil Society and Public Policy, was elected over the summer to the Order of Canada. According to the statement from the Crown, I believe, strictly speaking, Daniel Weinstock was appointed to the Order of Canada, and I quote, for his exemplary contributions to the advancement of political philosophy, public policy, and social justice in Canada, as a renowned ethicist, philosopher, and public intellectual. We are delighted for our colleagues, tremendously proud that they are all of them members of the research group on constitutional studies, and please join me. Nous les souhaitons des félicitations. Please join me in giving them a very warm round of congratulations and to their health. And one more note, because I'm very happy that we're able to do this part in person. As many of you know, as of this year, what had been the Research Group on Constitutional Studies Student Fellowship that brings together undergraduate and master's students in a weekly reading group that studies texts in the history of political thought and whose members make up the core of the audience for these events. As of this year, thanks to the generous support of alumni of that program and other friends of the program, the fellowship has been renamed as the Charles Taylor Research Group on Constitutional Studies Student Fellowship. For McGill alumnus and Professor Emeritus Charles Taylor, who did more than anyone to establish McGill as a site for the study of political theory and political philosophy, and indeed relevant to tonight's lecture for the study of religion and serious engagement with Catholic social thought. We are joined here tonight by Professor Taylor, and I would like in particular the Taylor Fellows to join me in thanking him for allowing us to rename it in recognition of what he has done to McGill, done for McGill, to make possible all of the work. I've got no notes. I occasionally make a mistake. All that he has done for McGill to make possible all of the work that we continue to do today. Before things get too chaotic in the reception, I will make two calls for photos, one for RGCS faculty to come join Professor Vallier at the front for a picture with the banner. And in light of that happy news, I hope that Professor Taylor will join the Taylor Fellows for a photo as well. And with that, please join me in extending our very warm thanks for a very stimulating lecture to Professor Kevin Vallier.